what I'd like to do is to focus really on three key questions here. I'm looking at things really from a strategic perspective. So I thought we could take a step back and try to take stock a little bit. And these are the three questions that I would like to address and think about how this could help us ensure that our institutions and our teachers and our students really manage to survive this very difficult period. I think the first impact of COVID has been the multiplicity of teaching scenarios that we are now familiar with, right? I'm sure many of you had this experience, literally from a Friday to a Monday, you were suddenly teaching online from not having done that before, quite possibly. I certainly came across many teachers who were, thrown into online teaching last March with very little preparation, if anything. So from that time, since last March, a number of different scenarios within our schools have emerged, I think. The first one is, well, of course, we have the physical, number one, the fully face-to-face normal teaching, if you like, in the physical classroom. And we seem to be going in and out of that as local lockdowns come into force or national lockdowns. We also have this face-to-face rotation model. This is something that where I live in Spain was introduced after the summer here, so from about last October in tertiary education. My stepson was attending a post-secondary school course, further education, and he would go to class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and his classmates would be at home working on their own, doing homework and stuff. And then the following week, he would go on Tuesday, Thursday, and those other classmates would go on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So it was a kind of a face-to-face rotation model. There was a little bit of online work, but not that much. It tended to be sort of PDFs, maybe watch some videos, maybe send the teacher some work via email. The second one is this, the third one, is this idea of, fully online, of course, which many of us were just thrown into. And that would normally entail some synchronous work, real-time work, and or asynchronous work, so work that takes place not in real time. Of course, this is a synchronous environment that we're in at the moment, where I'm communicating with you in real time. So synchronous and or asynchronous. Some institutions went for a very general blended approach that had some face-to-face, some online, fairly loose. It would be redefined on a kind of a monthly basis, it seemed. Blended learning, of course, has been around for quite a long time. Then we have our fifth scenario there, which is this hybrid kind of teaching. And you've probably heard this term really in the last year. It's been around for quite a while. Hybrid or HyFlex, it's also called. HYFLEX, HyFlex, which is a combination of the word hybrid and flexible. So HyFlex, I don't like that term much. But hybrid learning in our profession is being used for this idea of the teacher being in the face-to-face, physical classroom, face-to-face with the students physically, and at the same time having some students being beamed in, via Zoom or whatever, but at the same time. So it's really quite a complex sort of blended approach. It's a synchronous blended approach. Again, this is something that may feel new, but it's not. It's been around for at least a decade, probably more. It just wasn't very widespread, but it has become more familiar to people in the last year, I think. The sixth one there is this idea of hybrid rotation. So it's a bit like the face-to-face rotation, but it's deliberate in that you have your face-to-face students Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, they get beamed in via Zoom, and it sort of changes every week like that. So it's a sort of a more deliberate or intentional hybrid approach. So that's another one that I've also come across. And then I've put there number 7, other, because there may be another scenario that you're experiencing that I haven't come across. All right, so the second impact then, apart from the impact on our scenarios or the way we've been teaching, is obviously an impact on teachers, on us, and on our learners. And I'd like to start with the positives. That's why I have a plus sign there. So the positive impacts. In some ways, it has provided CPD, or continual professional development, for teachers in a very inadvertent or unexpected way. It's just sort of happened. They've had to learn all of these new skills. I don't know whether this was your case, that you suddenly developed skills that you just didn't have before, and you had to, you really had no choice. And I've come across, working quite closely with teachers over this last year. At the consultancy, we've been working with institutions and universities, helping them do this kind of move over to online and blended and hybrid. And many of the teachers that I've been working with actually say, wow, it was the term that I hear most often was steep learning curve. I don't know if you feel this was your experience, but you learned a lot in a short space of time. And that was actually quite stimulating, interestingly enough, for many teachers. I certainly found many teachers saying that. So that was a positive. Another positive, I think, is that blended and online learning are, on the map. They're now accepted as mainstream. Before, I've been teaching online for a very long time. People always thought it was a bit weird, and they didn't really think it was possible. How can you teach online? How can you do teacher development online? Well, you can. And I think we all know now that you can. It's no longer in question, at least. Another positive has been the development of digital literacies for teachers and for learners. You've had to improve not just your teaching skills, but also get a little bit more experienced with some of the really quite basic technologies that we have at our disposal. So including things like, Google Docs maybe for, group work for your students, or video conferencing platforms like Zoom or Skype or Adobe Connect or Teams or whatever you use. Another positive, and again, this I've heard quite a lot from teachers, is that they've found that the move online has suited especially their very quiet learners. And if they're teaching teenagers, they've found fewer discipline issues working online. It seems to be kind of easier in a way. I had one teacher say to me what she absolutely loved was she could just hit the mute button. Unfortunately, we can't do that in a face-to-face class with a group of teenagers. But these positives, with quieter learners working perhaps in pairs or in very small groups in breakout rooms, that seems to have helped them gain in confidence. I don't know about any research that's been carried out yet into this kind of thing, but it's certainly an interesting area. Of course, there's also been some negative impacts, right, on yourselves. I'm sure you found this, and on your learners. And the big one that everybody is talking about is the mental health toll that this entire pandemic has taken in terms of the isolation, the uncertainty. Of course, don't need to say too much about that. I'm sure you've all experienced it yourselves. Going back to our profession, though, of course, what's become very clear is that there has been a real lack of teacher training and a lack of digital preparedness for teachers. Teachers were often, as I said before, just thrown in to the online teaching from one day to the next with often no training and no support. And that really is tough. It's stressful. Although I have to say, from what I've seen, teachers managed beautifully, considering. Another negative is, of course, the physical space. So if you are having some sort of blended, physical classroom plus online, you have to have the social distancing in place. Maybe your school or your classrooms are not big enough, and that becomes a real issue, having the 2 meters between the students. And then, of course, the access to the online part is a challenge as well. Do your students have laptops? Do they have devices at home? Do they have reliable internet? It's been a challenge, and depending on the context, it's been more of a challenge than in others. Another challenge, I think, has been a lack of materials and really pedagogical models. So, what do I use to teach online, and how do I do it? How do I integrate the real-time, the synchronous work like this, video conferencing, plus what my students are doing asynchronously, maybe in a virtual learning environment. The last point there's been a lot of concern over assessment. So if everything's online, how do I run assessment? How do I give my students exams? How do I make sure that they're not cheating? This has been a big thing, talked about, all over the world and in all disciplines and at all levels of education. And I think that has some interesting repercussions for what assessment is, but I want to come back to that in a minute. This may be something, though, that you've also experienced as a concern, the assessment and this cheating, which I like to put in air quotes. All right, so you may have seen these yourself. If we step back a bit then and look at some of the impact on institutions, again, this has been a mixed bag. In some cases, we've had permanent school closures. Of course, I'm talking in the private sector, right? Public schools, government schools haven't really closed. But within the private language teaching sector here in Barcelona, where I live, we've had several very, very large, very well-established and very well-known language schools closing permanently because of this. And of course, job losses for teachers, clearly not your case, otherwise you wouldn't be here, so that's good. Another impact really for institutions has been, institutions asking themselves, which of these teaching scenarios is best? What do I do? Do I do blended? Do I do hybrid? Do I do fully online? Do I cycle in and out, and how? And of course, there is no best scenario because it's always going to depend on your needs and your students. The third point there, the expectations of your clients, in other words, your students or your learners, and the roles of the learners during the pandemic. I mean, how do they do it? What are they supposed to do at home? Parents, if you're teaching younger learners, what are their roles in terms of providing support or not providing support? The issue of teacher training has, I think, come to the fore, that institutions have realized that it is so important to have well-trained teachers if you want them to do a good job. The technology and the digital preparedness of your institution, do your teachers have the necessary equipment? Does your school have the necessary equipment? And are they digitally prepared? Are they digitally literate? The cost of all of this, fewer students in class, students dropping out, private language schools losing students, it's been major. And then going back to that point again about the physical distancing in the classroom and whether you have the actual space. So let's step back another step and try and look at some of the lessons that we've learned over the past year, because it has been already a year and it looks like it's going to be going on for a little while longer. Well, the first thing, as I said before, blended and online learning are here to stay. They've come to the forefront in the pandemic, but they are something that institutions need to consider longer term, not just for now, not just for this pandemic, and not just for the next pandemic. They are a way of teaching that I think have become mainstream, and they can add quite a lot of value to what you offer to your students. We've learned that learning is a social endeavor, obviously. I think we've learned that, students sitting alone, working through PDFs is not really the way to be doing distance or remote or online learning. We need to be having these kinds of synchronous sessions with our students as well. We need to ensure that there's a social element. And of course, language is social. Your students need to be using the language if they're going to learn it. Your teachers need to be trained, of course, and teachers need that kind of support if we want them to do a decent job. Digital literacies are absolutely essential. We've known this for a very long time, but I think it's come to the forefront even more in the last year. Institutions need to be nimble or fast because they need to be able to react. Do we have another lockdown? Okay, are we going hybrid? Are we going fully online? Are we going blended? What are we doing? We need to be able to move fairly quickly through these different teaching scenarios. I think assessment, as I mentioned before, needs a bit of a rethink, because if cheating is an issue and you're giving your students multiple choice tests and they're on the WhatsApp giving each other the answers, then, well, what are we actually testing? Maybe the types of assessment that we use need to be different. And as I said before, there's been a lot of conversation in our field about this over the last year. Don't want to get bogged down in it, but clearly, getting our students to produce things that they can't copy off each other, making open-ended projects perhaps part of assessment is something worth thinking about, along with formative as opposed to only summative assessment. And then the last point there, change is challenging, obviously, and we need to be resilient. And institutions need to, keep this in mind and help with their students and their teachers. Okie doke. So, well, where are we now? A year ago, I think we were here at the top. We were in this remote emergency remote teaching. And I think the word there, emergency, says it all, right? It was, literally do whatever we can. Let's get through this. But a year later, we can step back and draw some lessons from the last year and from the experience of everybody, institutions, teachers, students, parents of students if you teach younger learners. And we are now, or we certainly should be, in a stage of consolidation within our institutions. And that's what I want to look at now. How do we get to this stage of consolidation and make sure that we do consolidate? So this is what I want to address really in this sort of next bit of my talk. The idea of not just surviving through this very difficult time, but thriving, doing well, and making all of this experience help us move towards a brighter future, something that is more robust, that is pedagogically sound, and that is effective in terms of teaching and learning. And what I want to share with you is a strategic approach that we've been working with over the last year with institutions, looking at how to confront this challenge of basically the move online, the move to online and blended, but to like good online teaching and a good blended approach. And we've come up with a sort of fairly, I think, simple kind of 4-step strategic approach that I would like to talk you through. And this is something that, again, we've applied to a number of institutions, private language schools and universities, and slightly larger institutions as well. The first step then is a needs analysis, but in fact, you'll see it's plural there, right? Needs analyses. That's because it's not just one needs analysis. You need to be thinking about carrying out needs analyses with your teachers and also with your students. And if you're teaching students who are under 18, then also with the parents of those students. And those all need to be separated. And of course, bring in, the admin staff, the administrative part of your school or your university, and the directors or the directors of studies or academic directors or whatever you call them. But you need to speak to all of them. Basically, the first step is really to find out what their experience has been over the last year. What has it been like? What's worked for you and what hasn't worked so well? What are the sticking points? What are the challenges? But also, what are the successes of the last year? So it's that needs analysis looking back. What have you learned? But also looking forward. So what is it from that you can take and help us move forward? What can we apply from lessons learned, and what needs does that? What needs underpin that? How can we satisfy those needs? What do you think you need to make the online and the blended learning effective? And don't forget to speak to students. It's not just the teachers. Teachers will have plenty to say about this. And it's not just the stakeholders as well. Your needs analysis needs to include an institutional needs analysis. So you need to look at, for example, the Wi-Fi that you have available, the hardware. Where is it? Who has it? Does your institution have it? Do you provide it to students in the case that they need it? Exactly how ready are you? How tech ready from a hardware software point of view is your institution? I actually came across a very interesting approach here from a primary school in the United States. And what they were doing was that they found that their students, during these lockdowns, right, they were cycling in and out of lockdowns and a whole mix of scenarios. They found that not all of their students had access to, for example, laptops at home, especially if there were several children and maybe 1 or 2 devices in the house. It was just really difficult. So what they did was they prepared these little kind of, they call them like remote packs, little backpacks, which had a laptop inside plus a copy of, whatever the book was, with pencils and stuff and whatever would be needed. So that when kids were isolated, some kids would have to go into self-isolation and they'd be out for a couple of weeks and then back in. The kids could take these little backpacks away and they'd have everything that they needed to be able to take part without having to worry about that part. So I thought that was a really interesting initiative from a primary school. Of course, it assumes that your school has the means to be able to provide that. So first step, needs analyses. The second step there, I do like my acronyms, CPD, which is Continual Professional Development, and DLs, which is very close to my heart, Digital Literacies. those two things have got to be put in place within an institution. So I'm sure you found this when we all went into lockdown, everybody moved online. Maybe you did get some training, but the training tended to be very much this sort of what's called just-in-time training. So, how do I use Zoom? How do I use Teams? It was kind of, emergency training, just-in-time training. And it was often very, off the cuff. It was emergency, if you like. It focused on immediate needs, that kind of training. But of course, now a year later, we really need to be thinking about a longer term approach to online and blended learning. And this means looking at how to develop your teachers' online teaching skills, but also online task design and syllabus design and so on, and within a CPD framework, within a continual professional development framework. Now, there has been a lot of research into CPD, into what makes effective continual professional development. And there are a couple of things. First of all, it needs to be contextually appropriate, obviously, as everything does. It needs to be ongoing. So not just, a couple of webinars today and then there's nothing for a year. It needs to be continual. It needs to be cyclical. In other words, cycling back to stuff that you've done before. Not, here's how to use Zoom, everybody in an hour, done and dusted. You need to come back and make sure that teachers are using it in this kind of cyclical way. It also needs to provide teachers with the opportunity to put into practice what they've been learning. So there's the theory, there's the learning about, and then there's the learning to do. Not only just put into practice, but then reflect on that and then go back. So a kind of a cyclical, I think of it as a kind of a wheel, a framework. I think it was Donald Schoen, the reflective practitioner, this idea of input, practice, reflection, and on it goes. It doesn't stop. Another really important point, though, for CPD to work is that it has institutional support. Without that, it's not going to go anywhere. So that's an important point for institutions, that you need to have a fairly carefully developed CPD plan, and that plan needs to identify which are the best models for online and blended learning for your institution. And it might be several. It might not just be one approach. You might want to use several approaches and let students move between them or choose between them. So I've added also DLs here, digital literacies, because of course your CPD program needs to ensure that you support the development of your teachers and your learners' digital literacies. Don't forget that. All right, a third step is this idea of models and approaches. You'll remember before I said often institutions found that they just didn't know which model to use. What kind of online approach do I use? Hybrid, blended? I'm not sure what to do. And of course, there's no one best way. There are several different models and approaches. And your institution needs to explore the ones that work for your context. And that depends as well on your students, hence the needs analysis. The needs analysis comes before all of this. But a few sort of basic rules of thumb in terms of effective models of online and blended learning, and that is that you need to combine synchronous and asynchronous. It needs to have both. And these days, there's really no excuse because the technology is here, right? It's very easy to introduce a synchronous element like this through a platform like Zoom or whichever platform. And of course, it's also pretty easy to have the asynchronous part. So you might use Google Docs, or maybe you have a virtual learning environment like Canvas or Moodle or whatever in your institution, but you need to have both. And of course, those two things need to articulate. They need to speak to each other. They need to be connected. They need to be integrated. It's not that in this, live class we do X and then we do something totally unconnected when we're offline. But they need to kind of support and develop each other, as we would do in the face-to-face classroom. Okay, I think in terms of models, though, institutions really should be considering several looking forward if you want to make this sustainable. And that's not just the 100% online. We should be looking at 100% online plus blended models plus hybrid. Now that hybrid is becoming much more mainstream, as I said, it's been around for several decades, but now that it is more mainstream and we do have the technology, it is an option. It can be done well. but it's not something that you just fling your teachers into. You need to provide training and support and so on and so forth. And task development, task design, and course design is absolutely key for hybrid to be done well, apart from the tech skills, the technology skills. Okay, then the fourth step, and this one is something I'm sure you've all experienced as well, is when you have any kind of new approach in your institution, you need to pilot it. By pilot, I mean try it out. And normally a pilot will be carried out with a small group within your institution. So let's say you have a university with, let me just choose a round number, let's say 5,000 students. With a pilot, you don't roll it out with 5,000, you might roll it out with 500 or 100. You try it. That's where you make all of the mistakes, or you see the challenges that you hadn't foreseen. It all becomes clearer, you get feedback, you evaluate very thoroughly, and then you pilot again. So maybe you piloted with 100 the first time, so you pilot the second time with 500. And again, evaluate, get the feedback, iron out the problems, identify the challenges, see what needs to be fixed, and then again, iterate. So this idea of iterations or series is really important in piloting. Some of the issues that we've seen with institutions trying to introduce online and blended approaches is doing no piloting and rolling out, across an entire institution. Now that we do have time to consolidate, this is the time to be piloting different approaches. Just as one example, we were working with a university in Peru. This was a couple of years ago, actually. The university English department had been moved online. Basically, the directorship of the university had decided that the English department would be 100% online suddenly because they didn't really have the space. It was a problem of physical space in the university, and they just thought, well, let's just put all of the English courses online. And the teachers were, it was a bit of a, Friday to Monday scenario. They were thrown online. They didn't get much support. But we went in to do some work with teachers and look at setting up a CPD framework and so on. We found some very interesting things. Like, for example, the teachers were running synchronous classes like this they were using Adobe Connect, but the teachers weren't putting their videos on. So it was things like, the students were totally unengaged. The teachers were doing a kind of a lecture style, a bit like what I'm doing. Believe me, my language classes are not me just talking. They hadn't really had any support in how to design good synchronous real-time online classes. Also, the students had never been asked what they thought about this. So we did a needs analysis with the students, and we also got feedback from them. And we found that the students were absolutely furious. The university had sort of, practically not informed them, sent them an email, before their first class saying, you're moving online, with no real explanation. So there was a serious communications issue. So sometimes when you do your needs analyses and you look at what's going on in the institutions, it's not always about the teaching. It could be things like comms, communication, which was the case here, was one of the issues. It was a very interesting little project, I have to say. We all learned a lot. Okay, so there you go, four steps that are fairly straightforward, I think, fairly logical, and they can make a difference for your institution. So just to summarize, I think what I'm trying to say here in just a couple of words, and it's this, that to ensure a brighter future, we need a strategic approach supported by pedagogically sound approaches to blended and online learning, delivered by trained teachers within a robust CPD framework. I think that's the key message that I'm trying to get across to you here today. Okay, so I'd like to just thank you very much. These are my contact details, and please do feel free to email me if you'd like any references. I mentioned that there's been research into hybrid, for example. If you're interested in that, drop me an email and I can send you any information you might need. And I'm just going to pause there. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, the challenge remains in how to engage the students. Absolutely. I mean, that comes down to, task design, session design. Yes, and I think the use of breakout rooms is pretty key for language teachers, or for any kind of teaching, just to keep your students engaged. Right, Reham said, yeah, using students on engaging on a discussion board. I agree. Giving them asynchronous or synchronous spaces in which to communicate is absolutely essential. As we said, learning is social. Large groups of students, Rowan, yes, absolutely. And this is where, in a live session like this, breakout rooms are absolutely invaluable. Sora says, yes, assessment is an issue, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is this debate in the profession we should be redesigning assessment. If it's an issue that students are cheating, maybe it's the assessment that needs to be redesigned. Building rapport, yep. And again, having the live synchronous sessions helps with that, absolutely. Right, Adil says, yes, the pedagogical aspects is a challenge. You're absolutely right. Yes, that's one big difference that I've noticed over the last year. I've been working in teacher training and with technology for, over 20 years. And teachers always used to say, oh, the technology, I can't. And now working with teachers, when I say to them, what is the biggest challenge you're having? Almost nobody writes the technology. That used to be what people would always, teachers would always identify first as their biggest challenge. Not anymore. It seems that people's digital literacies have improved. Yeah, okay, Rowan, that's a good point here. That you don't want to have your students sitting around for 8 hours. You absolutely don't. One thing that I've used quite a lot in online training like this is we do these little mini breaks that work very well. So if your class is going to be more than an hour, you just take a 2 or 3 minute break after about 45 minutes. And get students to stand up and move away from the camera. And I often get them to go and do something. So one thing I did about a couple of weeks ago, which was quite fun, was I said, okay, everybody was at home, of course. We're in lockdown here, and we were in lockdown here in Spain. Go to the fridge and bring back a vegetable. So everybody went away for their 2-3 minutes, and they came back, and then I had them, holding up their vegetable to the camera. And then they had to say what it was and what they were planning to cook. This is a group of adults, what they were planning to cook with the vegetable. And it was just a little fun activity. And then the next time we got together a week later, I said, oh, can anybody remember what Sarah had? What was her vegetable? And of course, everybody remembers. It's also a very nice way to get students to put on their cameras. If you've got them to go away for a mini break and to come back with something and they have to actually hold it up and show everybody, and then talk about it, even if it's just for that period of time, it can be an effective way to introduce the use of cameras, because I think that is quite important. Arshad, especially design curricula for online teaching. I think it's task design. Right? The curriculum for language teaching, I don't think changes that much, but we need to look at how we provide our students with opportunities for speaking, all that kind of thing. How do we judge the efficacy of teaching online? There's a lot of research into it. It depends what you do. Ineffective, send your students a PDF and tell them to read it and assume they'll learn a language. Effective, use a good combination of asynchronous and synchronous and provide opportunities for what we know helps students learn a language. So second language acquisition shows us that they need input, but they also need output, right? This is what the research shows us. So if we give them those opportunities, it's going to be more effective. Okay, Rowan, yes, cameras perhaps in breakout rooms. We would certainly want cameras as much as possible. Assuming it's culturally appropriate, as I was saying, the context is all, isn't it? Okay, Ian, I think I'm gonna stop.